This movie wanted to be a dark comedy, but it just doesn't quite get there. What's up, everybody? So let's talk about How to Make a Killing, written and directed by Patton Ford, and it's starring Glen Powell, Margaret Qualley, Topher Grace, Ed Harris. And it has I think, like a really great cast. Unfortunately, I think the script and the direction don't really bring the best out of them. The premise of the movie is basically Glen Powell's character. His mother married into a very rich family. The patriarchy of this family passes away and leaves the fortune to the family. However, he's not going to see a penny of it unless all the other family members are no longer with us. And this is something like, it's a flippant comment that Margaret Qualley's character says to him at one point. And there begins the turning of the plot. You know, it begins to kind of marinate in his head, and then everything starts to happen because of that. And in the beginning, you know, like the first person that is unalived, I guess is the term that we can use now, it's kind of by happenstance. You know, it was an opportunistic moment, and Glen Powell's character makes the best of it. After that, he really does have to, do some due diligence and plan things ahead of time to what he wants to do. And, you know, the dark moments I feel like are very dark, you know, and the comedy moments have the potential to be funny, but I think one of the things in dark comedy is that you really have to kind of strike a very delicate balance, where if the dark moments are way too dark, then it almost has too much of a journey to go for you as an audience member to appreciate the comedy moments, you know? I think, like American Psycho is a perfect example of how like the balance is just right there. It doesn't go too dark. So even though it definitely implies that, but you have to kind of fill in the gaps for yourself. You don't see it on the screen. And when the kind of humoristic moments pop up, because it didn't go so far down the deep dark hole, you can still kind of chuckle and laugh a little bit, you know. But this one, it goes way down, and then when the funny moments are supposed to hit, it feels uncomfortable, you know. So that I thought was like, I think maybe it needed another pass, you know, another draft of the script, you know, to really kind of achieve that very delicate balance, as I said. Another thing that I thought was kind of, discombobulating is this whole passage of time. You know, the movie feels like it took place over the course of a few months, but then like there's this one phone call between Margaret Qualley's character and Glen Powell, and it's like, hey, remember when I talked to you, you know, a year ago? And, you know, you kind of ask yourself, like, seriously, a year has passed by? Felt like you guys had that conversation a few days ago, you know? So it's these little things that kind of take you out of the storyline, you know, which is not what you want when you watch a movie. You just want to be invested in the story, in the characters, and go on that journey with them. Now, if there's one thing that I think is done really well, it's the love interest character between Glen Powell and his partner. And it's very much what I think is maybe the emotional center of the movie, you know, where you don't see him as, you know, here's this guy offing people for money. You know, it feels like a very shallow thing to do within the context of the movie and how you feel about it. But then there's this, you know, these very kind of, dare I say, heartwarming moments between these two people. And it's as if you can see these two paths that are laid before him, where you can continue doing what you're doing, you know, so you can achieve this outrageous fortune, or you can, you know, continue this path with this woman and very possibly live a happily ever after, you know. And I feel like that would have been a really interesting conflict and dynamic to continue unfolding as the story goes. but it's just not explored, at least not for me anyways. I wish it would have been done a little bit more. You know, maybe the tone of the movie would have changed. It would have been something completely different. But at least I think the story would be way more interesting to engage with. You know, the way it stands right now is just like it's trying to be something, but just not landing. You know, which is unfortunate because you have like Glen Powell, who I think is one of the really solid actors who has like these movie star qualities. You know, he's charismatic, he's funny, he's handsome, and I feel like in a different time period he would have been an absolute movie star. But we're in the era that movie stars don't really exist anymore. And he picks really interesting roles for movies, and he does the absolute best with them. Uh, it's just that everything else around him sometimes doesn't really measure up. You know, Margaret Qualley's character, I love her. She was incredible in The Substance. And, you know, even with that bit part that she has in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is also really, really good and memorable. Um, but for most of the movie, you're asking yourself, why is she here aside from being this kind of femme fatale presence? Later on in the movie, she definitely affects the plot, but it's again, there's an imbalance there, you know, as far as, you know, her purpose within the story. You know, at some point, she just kind of feels like a plot device, which is important plot device, but the build up to that, I just don't think is handled properly. You know, so not the best use of a great cast. But if you still want to check it out because you love what Glen Powell does and you love Margaret Qualley, feel free. But I wouldn't spend my time watching this again. Anyways, those are my thoughts. What about you guys? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Smash that like button, give me a follow, and I'll see you guys next time.